Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, I'm going to be going through a report on a tournament I went to recently down in London. So, this tournament, it's a pretty casual one. There's no prize pool. It's very cheap to enter. So, yeah, essentially, it's just going to be lots of different players coming together and hopefully bringing sort of a variety of stuff that you might normally not see in a more competitive type event. You'll probably be able to see that in the list that I'm taking. It definitely has some more competitive elements to it, but there's also a couple of choices that I think are maybe a bit off meta, and hopefully will be stuff I haven't really tried that much, and it'll be interesting to see how it goes. So I'm going to be sort of firstly talking about the list I'm going to take. I'm recording this part before I go to the tournament, and then I'll sort of go through the games one by one and talk about how they went and if the list sort of performed as I hoped it would. So, first of all, the list. You should be able to see it on your screens now. If I can be bothered, I might flash up some pictures of the models I'm taking and how I've painted them and stuff. I'm actually painting some of them as we speak. They're sat on my desk now, so it'd be interesting to see if I get those done in time. Unfortunately, Sleeper Cell aren't going to be painted in time, which is a bit frustrating, but I have been able to get the Tauntauns together, which is quite nice. So firstly, the units I'm taking, taking Leia with Improv. I don't have the points for anything else. Ideally, I'd be taking, Scanner, even Vigilance, maybe if I had the points, but I don't. So I think this is fine. I ummed and ahed about Leia versus just the normal Rebel officer, but I think Leia brings quite two relatively useful command cards, one much more useful command card, and one fairly useful command card, which I will be using. So yeah, I think it's a fine choice here, and Leia's never a bad choice in your army. So yeah, looking forward to using her. Then operatives, where it gets a bit more interesting. Firstly, I've got sort of budget Luke Skywalker coming in at just over 180. I think he's 185 points in this spec, or it might even be 186. Burst of Speed, Jedi Mind Trick, and Hunter. I'm pretty sure Hunter procs on melee attacks. If not, this will be swapped out for offensive push to get that aim. But yeah, Burst of Speed to increase that threat range, Jedi Mind Trick to pretend I've got You Serve Your Master Well, but I don't. And it's also just useful for dishing out suppression and gives me something to actually use his Master of the Force on. But yeah, it's just cheap version of Luke. I would have tried to have squeezed in Force Push, but that would probably require dropping an act on the Ewok Slingers, which now I'm thinking about it may actually be worth it, and I may actually end up changing this, but we'll see how we go. Yeah, and then over to the other operative slot, I've gone for Din Djarin with his flame projector, his jetpack, and Grogu, not the Beskar spear. I did try and find the points for Beskar spear, but I just couldn't find them. So he's going without. Grogu, I think, has some really good, obviously, potential upsides, but also has potential to do very little. If nothing else, though, he does give Mando an extra HP effectively, which is quite nice. So, yeah, he will be an interesting inclusion and gives me access to his 2-pip, which I am intending to take here, even if it's not that good. Then moving over to the core slots, got 2 Naked Rebel Troopers. Again, just don't have the points in this list. I am 12 acts with some pretty expensive units, so yeah, I had to make some cuts somewhere. And then Fleet with the Scattergun and Impact Grenades. I'm anticipating this is a bit of an anti-meta, as it were, take, but I'm anticipating there being quite a lot of armor, so this is one of my nods to that fact. Fleets with the Scatter and Impact Grenades, just a little bit of anti-armor tech, but not that much. Sleeper Cell with the Astromech and the Special Forces slot, again pretty standard. Bistan Pathfinders, again pretty standard. And some Ewok Slingers to pad that activation. I think if, in a later version of this list, if I am going to cut an activation, it would be the Slingers to put Force Push on Luke, but we'll see again if I can find the points to make that happen. 11 acts really doesn't feel like that many, but it may just about be worth it to get that Force Push on Luke. Then I've got an AT-RT with the laser cannon in the support slot. Again, this is just a very standard pick. Quite a cheap activation and should be just quite useful for padding out the support slot for the 2 lots of Tauntauns I've decided to bring. Not really used Tauntauns much in this edition. I used them a couple in the games right at the start and thought they were actually half decent. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see if I can actually get value from them with sort of the way the meta has evolved. I'm a bit worried about them just being blown away in 1 or 2 attacks, but we'll see how we go. And then one of them has got the comms jammer on it, just so it can charge in, maybe in combination with Luke/Mando, and actually try and sort of lock out maybe some enemy units and prevent them getting any orders. So it should be quite interesting. In terms of command cards, I've gone for Son of Skywalker, and this is the way. Giving Din Relentless is just fantastic, and Luke getting that double attack, especially with Hunter, could be really useful. So I'm hoping that will be some nice synergy we can get in. Potentially, if they're already wounded, get a couple of aims off with that Hunter, which with that 7 black dice pool could be really useful. Then I've gone for the hand thing. I think if you're taking Grogu, you're almost like obliged to do this. It's a bit like in chess where you have to en passant, even if it's not tactically the right thing to do. And then I've gone for No Time for Sorrows. Could have gone for my ally is the Force, the 2-pip that gives out dodges, but I think that speed 1 move again could be super useful. And as far as I'm aware, this will work with Tauntauns because they are a trooper, even though they are a creature trooper, so that could be quite useful. Then for 3 pips, I've gone for I Am a Jedi. It's just a situationally sometimes phenomenal card. Like if Luke is locked in with, a Vader, a Dooku, or whatever, like he could really shut them down, which could be really nice. And Someone Has to Save Our Skins is just a fairly solid 3-pip that, again, if you want to, can be really useful for getting Leia and something else to go quite quickly, which could be really useful. And then obviously standing orders. In terms of yellows, gone for mark targets, sweep and clear, and surface scan. Sweep and clear because we have a decent amount of mobility in this list, and I should be able to pick off some enemy units possibly in their zone. In terms of mark targets, we have some units that should be able to survive fairly well, and some units I don't mind sitting back a bit more passively. And then ordnance, because again, this is a little bit of a nod to some potential armor and things like that, because we do need something to be able to actually deal some damage, because I don't really have any beyond the Bistan Pathfinders and maybe Luke and the fleets swinging in melee. Greens, advanced intel, because I think it's the best one in the game. Cunning deployment, because dodges are really useful for rebels, and ordnance, because, as I said. The reds, close the pocket, bunker, and intercept. Basically, I wanted the sort of close range ones and then close the pocket. I think the sort of corner deployments really favour this list because I do have some really mobile units that could sort of apply pressure in a certain area and then move across the board to help support on the other side. So that's kind of what I'm hoping the Tauntauns will do. I think I'm likely to maybe a bit more passive with them in the early game, and then later in the game they could be super useful for just bombing around the board and having a really good threat range. So we'll see how it goes. I was tempted by things like breakthrough or shifting priorities, but I don't quite have the long range options in this list, even though I do have good mobility to be able to sort of cope with all of those at the same time. So I think this, in terms of having sort of good maneuverable, strong units to be able to jump onto those objectives, could be really useful. But yeah, in terms of like thinking about how this list should work early on in the game, basically, the only things that really matter on turn 1 are going to be the Tauntauns because they have really good threat range potential. I'll also try and hold the Pathfinder as long as I can, and if there is an opportunity for Sleeper Cell to come on and do some damage, that would be really useful. So actually, one of the main reasons the Slingers and the AT-AT are in here is to pad those sort of command tokens, as it were, because if I draw one of those early, even though I do have improv, it is nice just to be able to drop one of those and without having to worry about, it's nullifying one of my more powerful activations that I'm hoping to be dropped later on. But yeah, Luke and Din will do what they do. I think Din Djarin is quite interesting in that I'm not running the spear, so I think what may actually end up happening a bit with Din is he may sit in melee almost to protect himself from being shot. So it might be the case he tries to go a bit later in the turn into a unit that's already activated, and then he can use his knife to do, maybe like a wound or 2 if he's lucky in melee, and then shoot out with his pistol because it does have versatile. So that could be something that could maybe work out quite nicely. And yeah, getting Grogu in and, possibly pulling off that mind trick effect or whatever it is could be really useful. And, dropping, if Grogu pulls off a heal or something useful, that would be a really nice moment because I've used him a couple of times and it never quite, it's always the one you don't need that seems to trigger, like when you really need the heal, you get the sort of mind trick effect and then vice versa. So we'll see how we go. Bit of a shame to have the naked rebel troopers. Like I do love an ion gun, but again, if I want a reasonable activation count with the kind of units I've got in here, then you just can't have kit on the on the basic dudes. I think the special forces slot speaks for itself. Again, might be that if I have a change of heart last minute that you see the slingers get dropped and force push come in. But it's interesting because I have used Luke a fair bit and force push has always felt really good, but there are also times where you just get completely locked out and you can't really do anything. So we'll see how we go. But yeah, there'll probably be a cut now, and it'll probably jump to me sounding pretty sad after the list has gone 1 and 2 or 0-3 at the tournament, and it's not worked out quite as I planned. But yeah, so here we are. Going to go through the 3 games I played at the tournament, and basically what I'm going to try and do is I'm giving sort of a bird's eye view of each of the games I played. I'll go through the different cards, primary, secondaries, and then the greens we had, and I'll try and go through sort of roughly what happened round by round. I did take some photos. Obviously, there's quite a lot going on at a tournament, so you don't always have a perfect memory, so some of this will be a bit of an approximation. But yeah, let's get into the first game. So, in the end, I did end up taking force push on Luke, so there's no unit of Ewok slingers in my list. And on my opponent's side, they were bringing actually a fairly similar list to me in the grand scheme of things. They had Sabine, Mando, basic rebel officer, 3 rebel vets with the Mark II, and then the heavy blaster as well, and a couple of units of Tauns and an AT-AT. So actually quite a few similarities between our 2 lists. We vetoed through. We ended up with close the pocket and destroy enemy base, and then my green was advanced intel and his green was strafing run. So we dropped our 2 bombs. Sorry, our bases. These are the green circles here. So he was red player, so he put his as a little green circle you can see in the top of the screen, and then mine was in the sort of right at the bottom right behind these pieces of terrain. Should be noted, I've only sort of noted roughly where like the heavy and like significant bits of terrain were. There were obviously some bits of light scatter in between these as well, but you can only get so much on a picture without it becoming an incoherent mess. So, in terms of how the first turn went, we both picked standing orders, which you'll notice there's a little bit of a theme, and again, if you've played any amount of Legion, unless you have some really good setup cards, standing orders tends to be the default on turn 1. He was 1 extra act over me, so he had 12, I only had 11, so no passes here. I did obviously have my advanced intel pass, which was quite nice. And then I lost the roll off here, so I had to effectively deploy my units first. So I began by bringing on the rebel troopers. I gave my order to Luke in this case, so Mando was in the bag, as was Leia. He gave his order to the rebel officer. Should be noted, he also, all the units that had prepared positions, he gave prepared positions to. So he dropped his Mark IIs and his rebel vets nice and early to get those dodges. I think prepared positions is quite interesting because I think if you only have 1 or 2, unless it's like Anakin with his 1 pip, it's normally not worth it. But actually, if you can get a critical mass and they have, those dodges and things, like actually it works okay. Like I don't think. I think it needs some other advantage beyond just the single dodge, but it does feel all right. And yeah, it gives you some initiative early, which is quite nice if you're maybe playing a bit more of an aggressive list. So yeah, come back to sort of the order the units came on in. He obviously had a lot of core in his bag, so he was cycling through those quite early, which is good for him. Brought his rebel officer on, who handed out a few dodges and things. He was able to save his Tauns to the end, which was quite nice, and ended up moving them up quite aggressively, and they had a shot at Leia. Actually, they were just in range of Leia on this one and did a wound or 2 to her, which was pretty nice for him. I didn't really get to do much shooting here. The AT-AT did plink off like a wound or 2 on his AT-AT. That was definitely a feature of this game, those 2 plinking each other. Yeah, my Tauns weren't in range to shoot anything this turn, so they just moved up to try and take quite a central position in the board. And then obviously he moved Sabine to try and threaten those 2 objectives on the sort of left side of the board as we're looking at it. Yeah, the Mandos plinked at each other. Again, there's a bit of a feature of this game, so I think my Mando did 2 wounds to his, and he did 1 wound back. We both had Grogu, which was nice. It was the Grogu mirror match, which you don't see very often. Unfortunately, in this game, neither of us got a whole lot of value off. There were a few sort of clutch moments where it could have come through, but it ended up sort of not mattering too much. And then you can see everything else there. Luke, fleets, the sleeper cell and Leia were all hunkered down behind this line of sight blocking, and then I had my pathfinders at the back to try and plink off some standbys and things. Should be noted, the standby net you can weave with the rebel vets and the heavy blasters and stuff is quite scary. Like, you don't want to run into it, and it does give you a bit of space. There are obviously ways around it if you have range 4, or if you are able to sort of take one standby off, it suddenly generates a bit more space. But yeah, it was definitely a tricky thing to play into, and it did come into effect later on in the game as well. So moving into round 2, I played No Time for Sorrows. The orders in this case went on to Luke, and they also went on to a unit of Tauns over there on the left-hand side. Not Tauns, sorry, they went on to Sleeper Cell in this case, just so they could pop round the corner and have a shot at the Tauns. He obviously played Covering Fire, which gave all of his core units an order, which was actually really nice. Like, it's not the same as order control, but it did at least mean that, you know, he was drawing some quite impactful units out of the bag. His Tauns grabbed a bit of initiative here. Again, did a wound or two to Mando, which was quite annoying. But then Sleeper Cell were able to activate, pop round the corner, and blew away one of the units of Tauns. And then Luke was able to dive in later in the turn and hit the other unit of Tauns. So they were severely weakened by this point. And then dived Luke into cover around the side of the building, ready for next turn. His Rebel Vets and Mark IIs were just pushing up the board in this case, trying to threaten this objective here on the right-hand side. My Tauns did have a couple of plinks here, so they were doing sort of almost like the hand thing of moving up and then moving back. So even I basically triggered the standby on this sort of furthest left Mark II, and then was hoping to kill it, but its cover rolls were on point, and its dodges that it was being fed and things like that really started to add up. So it was able to hang on for another round. It was basically, I think, left on 1 wound at the end of this round. Sabine jumped up, took a couple of shots at my rebel troopers, but I was able to get the dodges on them before she was able to go, so she only did like a wound or 2 with her surge to crit. And then the ATRTs just carried on plinking at each other. Mando again shot at Mando. They were just sort of plinking off each other at this point. My Mando was down to 2 wounds, and his had taken 3 wounds by this point. So yeah, not a whole lot was happening on that side, but there was a bit of plinking going on. And then sort of Leia and the fleets were just ready to jump and go for that central objective, go for that right-hand objective when I thought it was appropriate. At this point, the round ended 2-2. Nothing for destroy enemy base. I controlled the central objective, and he was able to control the left-hand objective and the right-hand objective. Unfortunately, the unit of rebel troopers weren't quite in range to score, but the ATRT was, which was a bit of an oversight I made. Just left them slightly out of scoring range. Moving into the next round, I was running Hunter on Luke, so I Son of Skywalkered Mando, and just instantly blew him up. My opponent played Legacy of Mandalore, and then gave orders to Mando, his commander, and Sabine, which gave him like dodges and aims and things on Sabine. So again, nothing I could do about Sabine on this side of the board. Like, she was just dominating the space, but she wasn't quite able to do enough. Like, she can only be in one objective at once, right? And she was kind of needed on that left-hand objective to help clear up my dudes as well. So Son of Skywalker just instantly blew away Mando, and then I jumped up onto the building and force pushed a rebel vet into me, thinking that would leave me safe. What I forgot is you can still be punched to death by rebel veterans, and he aim punched with both of his units and ended up doing like 4 or 5 wounds to Luke. So suddenly he only had 2 health left, and I was actually starting to realize that he was probably going to die next turn, and it was just through no fancy attacks or anything. It was just being slowly punched down by the rebel vets, which was a bit of an oversight. And I think it was something I reflected on at the end of the game. I was like, yeah, you assume just because a force user is in melee with, a rubbish core troop or whatever, that they're not going to do anything. But actually, with an aim punch, putting 5 hits through, suddenly they become a lot more of a threat. Again, I was holding the center really well. Like, the Tauns were just so strong in this game. It gave them so much flexibility. Like, the speed 3 and that base just means they can kind of be wherever you need them to be as quick as possible. And yeah, it was really nice. And they were able to sort of jump in, jump back, do some shooting, and grab me that central objective, which was really nice. This one again, unfortunately, my rebel troopers were panicked. They had 2 suppression on them, which meant they weren't able to score this left-hand objective. and my ATRT was able to hold that objective, but obviously it was 2-1 on this one, so I lost that one again. My opponent continued to hold the right-hand objective. He had 2 units, I think, in scoring range. I only had the fleets, so wasn't able to grab this objective this time. But the wounds were really starting to add up for him. He lost 2 quite key units in the Tauns and Mando, and I was had lots of healthy units left, so there was definitely sort of a feeling of momentum moving towards me at this point. And then this was where sort of it all started to fall apart a bit for my opponent. So aside from the fact he was able to punch Luke down early in the turn, basically we both played 1 pips. He won the roll off, and he went straight for the bag because Sabine wasn't super relevant at this point. So straight out of the bag and got a core trooper, and they did 5 hits to Luke and were able to punch him down. I might put the picture in here just for the confirmation that was how it ended for Luke, which is a bit sad, but yeah, that happens sometimes. But yeah, then in my return, I had Mando was able to go, who was able to blow up one of the nearest Mark IIs, and then also get the flamer off on another unit of vets, which meant he was able to clear up 2 units on the objective, which was really nice, and get those speed 3 moves in. Yeah, and then my Tauns were starting to push across. Unfortunately, I'd given the bomb to Mando, which I probably should have mentioned earlier, in this scenario, which wasn't ideal. He'd put his on the unit of Tauns that had been blown up. So while Mando would have probably been in scoring range the following turn, just due to the time-sensitive nature of the tournament, we realised we weren't going to have time for another round. So I wasn't going to score the destroy enemy base in this game. So yeah, this objective, as you can tell, was a bit of a mess. His Tauns were pretty crippled by this point, but were still just about okay, and were able to get into scoring range. Unfortunately for him, I was able to get my Tauns, Sleeper Cell, and Leia into scoring range, which countered his 3. So it was a draw on that objective. Then I was able to hold the central objective, and while Sabine finally was able to clear up my rebel troopers, who just had clung on so well with all the dodges and things, my ATRT finished off his ATRT, and it was a draw on this left-hand objective. So it ended up with a 2-0 in this final round to me. I think if we had played another round, I like to think I'd have got to 12 on this. I just had so many more units left, and still having Mando around on like not great health, but still enough health was pretty nice. And yeah, we're in a pretty strong position at this point. But it was an interesting game, and I definitely think the covering fire 3 pip was really well used in this game to generate all those dodges and things. It was super annoying to deal with. Yeah, so a 6-4 win, and I think made a couple of errors, but actually was overall fairly happy with how I played in that one. Moving on to game 2, this was a really interesting matchup. I personally feel that droids are the strongest faction right now, and I think this game, to me, showed a lot of what I think makes droids really strong. So he was double snail, some big B1 squads with the poison gun, which I thought was quite interesting. It played really well into my sort of doing a bit of chip damage to a unit and then leaving that poison token on them to finish them off. Couple of nice B2 squads with the is it the T1 or something, the tactical droid on them, and the 3 units of droidicas, also with Kalani running around at the back. In this game, I was again blue player, and we both had cunning deployment, and then we were playing on breakthrough, which I think again is similar to close the pocket. Anything with slightly funky deployment kind of played into the Tauns and the Mando here, which sort of let me maybe deal with threats on one side of the board and then use that speed to go over and threaten the other side of the board, which is kind of part of my thought around this list. We were also on recon mission, which for both of us suited us really well because we both had units that were tough and would likely be at range 2 of units. So he put his on one of the units of B2s and I put mine on Luke. So round 1, we both played standing orders. Already talked about this. Don't think we need to talk about it again. He dropped his droidicas very aggressively, and he also dropped them quite early in the turn, and this meant that I was able to start. Because basically what I found with droidicas is as long as you can start chipping them early and getting rid of those shields, they become a lot less intimidating. But as soon as it gets to slightly later in the turn, they become that much more difficult to do. That much later in the game, they become that much more difficult to deal with. So I was able to get some plinks with the Pathfinders, which was really nice. Sleeper Cell reduced one of the droidicas down to just 2 wounds left, so straight through the shields, and did a bunch of wounds to them as well, which was nice. Couldn't quite get the fleets in this turn, and they didn't quite have the range, but they were able to move up quite aggressively. And then the Taunts leapt up and plinked some shields off the droidicas as well. So some nice weakened droidicas early on, which was really good for me. His return fire did a lot of damage to my AT-RT. It was down to 2 wounds on the first turn. And then with this second unit of Tauns for me in the centre, I think in hindsight I moved them up too aggressively. I think I should just have grouped them up with my other unit of Tauns and just sort of swept around the edge of the board and then moved to challenge later on. But basically, I dropped Luke fairly centrally. I wanted him to be able to respond to where the threats appeared. And then, yeah, I left Leia and a squad of troopers and the AT-RT to hopefully just basically clog things up more than anything else. I was aware they weren't going to be able to hold this very long, but I was hoping they'd be able to do enough. Yeah, and then he transported his B2s, which is just really good. Like, it gives them such a jump forward. And it gave them, yeah, some really scary like board control in the center, which I thought was. My opponent wasn't like super experienced, but I think made some like really smart plays in terms of like how he controlled the space in this game, because I did feel quite hemmed in at points. I dropped Mando on the right hand side of the board. This was a mistake. Unfortunately, it meant that he spent most of the game just sprinting across to the other side of the board, because while he did help do a bit of plink damage over here, I was basically worried that he would sort of push up with his droidicas and his tank directly for his objective, and I thought I might just need Mando to help secure it. But in hindsight, I would have moved Mando much further across the board. But yeah, nothing died super early, but there was definitely some hefty plink damage going on, and I was a bit concerned about how the rest of this game would look. So turn 2, we both played 2 pips. He just played the basic push, and I was No Time for Sorrows, which I think was in my layer review. I was like, I think this is a best command card, and I stand by that. Like that speed 1 jump forward with force users and things like that. Like so often in this list, that is going to go on Luke and maybe like a unit of Tauns or something, just to give them a bit of that jump forward. But yeah, that was good for me, and I lost the roll off in this case, so he was going first. He was able to blow away my AT-RT with one of his snails, not particularly surprising. And his B2s were also starting to push up quite centrally. The Taunt in the center for me was really quite weakened by this point, so I just charged it into melee with the B2s after they activated, just to keep it safe from all his shooting, which I think was actually one of the smarter plays I made in this tournament, because they did really clog things up for him quite nicely. Leia was shot by the 2 B1 squads. The big B1s with the poison gun were just a lot more threatening than I assumed they would be. Like, they were doing like 5 or 6 hits with the poison, and yeah, it was just too much for Leia to deal with. I then moved the troopers back really defensively behind LOS blocking, just to try and later in the game just try and clog things up as much as possible. But yeah, the left side of the board was cleared out really quickly for me, and that was something that was definitely a mistake in hindsight. Right hand side of the board was looking a lot better though. I was able to finish off the 2 squads of droidicas, and then this top squad of droidicas had no shields and was down to 4 HP in total left on the unit, which was really good. The Pathfinders were instrumental in just, again, getting rid of those shields quickly with that ion and things like that, so that was really nice to see. Luke jumped in to the B2s, did, I think, 5 or 6 hits, and I think like that translated like 3 or 4 wounds, which was pretty good. Like, not mad at that. It was a bit annoying he wasn't able to get his Hunter off. I think Hunter was an interesting inclusion here, and I do stand by it in some ways, but I think actually it's so matchup dependent, and a lot of the time, you know, you'd rather have Into the Fray or Seize the Initiative or something. So yeah, it's tricky to say whether or not it was value here. And as I said, Mando was just leaping across the board, wasn't shooting at this point, was just doing speed 3, just to try and get across, because I had that flamer on him, and I was aware that that would be super useful for clearing out the B1s that would inevitably end up on this bottom objective. But yeah, a 3-2 score. We both got our scanners off, and I was able to hold my 2 objectives. His B1s weren't quite in challenging range, so I got 2 for that. And then his bottom one was clear as well. And my Tauns, as you can see, were able to just challenge that top objective by just being close enough, which was super nice. And another benefit of the taunt, like I think anything with relentless does just give them like the ability to just leap in while attacking in sort of later on in the turn, and just to challenge that objective, which is really nice. Moving into round 3, it's another Son of Skywalker, and he also played a 1-pip mechanized incursion. This time I was able to win the roll off, which was a big deal here. It let me go first, and as far as possible try and grab some initiative, which I was really starting to run out of. So I went first with Sleeper Cell, and they were able to shoot the tank in the side and reduce it down to just 2 wounds left. And then the Pathfinders were able to come in and plink it down after a bit of help from the Tauns as well earlier in the turn. Yeah, so that was really good. Like, getting rid of that tank early was really nice and gave me a bit of space. What I hadn't allowed for was the Droidicas, who survived a Fleet Trooper shot despite only having 1 shield and 4 HP left. They were left on 2 HP, and then they ball moded away and headed down towards my bottom objective. Fortunately, they weren't quite in challenging range this turn, but yeah, it was a pretty aggressive move by my opponent, and was really interesting to see like the sort of shift of the Droidica from, you know, being this quite stationary thing holding that top objective to just flying down to that bottom objective. I did lose my my Rebel Trooper unit down the bottom. They were shot by the healthier snail at long range. And Luke dived into the B2s and hit them twice, reduced them down to just 1 wound left, which was really nice. Again, annoying that they were still hanging around, but good to clear them out. Unfortunately, my Rebel Troopers also got cleared on the bottom objective, which was, it was pretty rough on the left-hand side of the board. And while I did have Luke and Mando heading over there, I worried it was going to be too little too late. And he had this really strong core with Kalani just handing out all the buffs and the aims and the dodges and the things, like kept his list going really well. But yeah, it was all going to come down to the final round. Fortunately on this one, so we both scored 2 for the unchallenged objective in the centre, and then we both scored 1 for our having our home objectives be clear, and then I think we both got our scanners off as well. So that left the score at 7-6. Coming into the final round, so it was again like this was because I was down on activations. I was basically having to rely on making like quite big plays, and I started off by jumping in with Mando with the flamer. Insert image of the dice roll here, which was pretty ridiculous. I think with the flamer on the mega squad combined with his pistol, he did like 14 or 15 wounds, which was enough to just completely blow the squad away, which completely changed the game. Like, if that squad's left on 1 HP, again, it's a swing in VPs, and it's still an activation he has as well, which you can use to tie stuff up. So really good play from Din, and that flamethrower definitely coming in clutch, as well as his 1-pip paying off as well. I was also able to go with my fleets before he was able to go with the Droidicas. They were able to move down and finish them off. Pathfinders were reduced to just 1 HP by a long-range shot with the tank, but they were able to just about hold on thanks to Danger Sense. And Sleeper Cell and the Taunt were able to secure that top objective quite nicely. Luke then leapt across the board after finishing off the B2 squad, jumped into these B1s, and then force pushed them back as well to make sure they wouldn't be in scoring range. Which again meant that I'd secured that objective, which was, I don't know. It was a really interesting game overall. I think there were some big momentum shifts, and this wasn't EXD, so no. Well, he could have had outmaneuver and defensive protocols on his tanks. Instead, he just had the armor-piercing shells. But I don't know. I think, had those tanks had the defensive protocols and the outmaneuver stuff going on, I don't actually think I could have killed them. And as it was, like, I threw so many resources at killing that top tank. And I think it's really interesting that, you know, they have this weak point, but with the way armor sort of functions now, be it armor 2 or armor 5 or whatever, you either have the choice of trying to sort of whittle like it down with small shots going through, So, you know, with your critical, your impact, surge crit, whatever. Or you used something like Sleeper Cell or Fleet, and you just hope to go over the top of the armor and deal damage that way. And I couldn't really tell in this game which was more efficient. I'll talk more about this in the final game as well, but I think with the rise of ATRTs, Aquas, and even Rebels as well, with just sort of having these like baseline of a certain number of dodges, like I wonder if we're starting to move back towards bigger dice pools becoming better again, because there will just be more things that almost act like the old heavy cover, like in Droidicas as well, right? Like they have these sort of standard amounts of block that they're always going to be able to use. And sometimes I do think just having those bigger dice pools to be able to, you know, get over the top of those things more efficiently might be the way to go. But yeah, really good game, and an opponent who did seem to be like fairly new to the game, but like made some really good plays, and like it definitely could have gone either way, but there were just some big moments like the Mando Flamer and stuff like that that paid off for me. So yeah, an 11-8 win, which I was pretty happy with. So 2-0 at this point, I was pretty pleased. I didn't really know how this list was going to go, and it was kind of playing out how I expected it to, actually, which was really quite reassuring when, you know, a list plays out how you hoped it would. So for this game, my opponent had just a whole mishmash of stuff. They'd just received their Aquas and their Crabs, so they wanted to take those out for a spin. And Dooku, Super Attack, few B1s, and some Magnas. Magnas with the extra trooper. It was really interesting. Aquas had the heavies. Dooku had push, choke, burst of speed, standard stuff. This was a really interesting battle because I didn't really know a lot about the Aquas and the Crabs. Like I'd seen the stat line before, but I didn't really know how they would feel like on the board. But I'll come on to it later. But my goodness, like they had some pretty strong stuff going on, and I'm a little bit concerned about how strong Aquas seemed in this game. But that's maybe a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. So vetoed through, both got ordnance, which I was really happy with. He had a lot of stuff with armor, which was really useful. And the only play I think in this game that I made in this game, and I was like, yes, that was a good play. Was made quite early on, so we'll come into that in a second. But yeah, closed the pocket again, quite a nice deployment for me, and it sort of forced my opponent to move quite centrally and bunch up. Unfortunately, his army kind of wanted to do that anyway, so it wasn't as much of an advantage as I'd hoped. But yeah, it did work out okay. And then we surface scanned, which again is one of the sort of the more straightforward ones to score. Like especially on this deployment, you're most of the time not going to be hiding in your corner, so worked out pretty well for me. So we both played standing orders round one. It's a classic. He did play the do not underestimate our means, whatever the 3 pips called that gives them reinforcements. He divulged that, but yeah, apart from that, not a whole lot going on. And the orange circle in the top left is where I put my ordnance, and I did that turn 1. And my thinking with this was basically I want to force him to sort of bunch up on the right hand side, and it worked really well. I didn't take advantage of that, but it did at least achieve what I hoped it would, and I was really pleased with that aspect of it. But yeah, again, gave my order to Luke, and he gave his order to Dooku. I say he gave his order to Dooku because it's separatists. He ended up with just the 2 crabs in the bag somehow. Don't know how that's possible, but yeah, that's absolutely fine. I think until other factions get the kind of access to order control that droids have, I think droid turn 1 will always be one of the most bonkers things in this game. Like, I think it's really interesting with separatists. I don't think they have the raw power of, say, the Gar or rebels. Even like Sleeper Cell, for instance, is I think more sort of stronger in terms of raw power than any unit maybe that separatists have access to. But just the consistency of being able to bring things out when you want to with the separatists is such a big deal. And the lack of order control in rebels forces you to use powerful units in a suboptimal way, and that really can be quite crushing sometimes. But yeah, I basically deployed sort of fairly evenly. I had the Tauns behind a line of sight blocking near the center. The idea was they could either go left or right and respond to wherever the threats appeared. Then, because he was stacking his units on the right, I tried to do the same. So I had Mando and Luke hiding behind some LOS blocking, ready to go for that objective if they needed to. Sleeper Cell were there as well. Unfortunately, it did leave Sleeper Cell slightly exposed around the corner, because even though it doesn't look like it in this picture, this building was slightly curved, and it meant that they could be sort of shot around the corner and gradually whittled down, which was super annoying. And then I left fleets in a similar position within sort of a speed 2 move and a range 2 shot of being able to challenge that objective. Then at the ATRT, I basically wanted to keep it hidden from sort of his impact stuff on the crabs and whatever, just so they could try and, again, do some plink damage to the Aquas at long range. And then I put Leia and a couple of Rebel Troopers on this far left objective, because I figured they would be able to hold that by themselves, given how little units he'd put on the left-hand side of the board. This was the turn where the game was decided, unfortunately, and it was decided not in my favour. Sleeper Cell died early. The Aquas were able to plink them down, and at that point, they'd already taken a couple of wounds from the B1s and the Aquas, but at that point, I was like, actually, I don't really know how I now deal with some of the threats he's got on the board. Like, I just don't think I have access to the damage I need. So I split my Tauns up to try and sort of increase my threat range, as it were, and like try and sort of hold his units back a bit. But the Tauns just didn't have the damage output to really push the units back in the way I'd hoped. You can't really see it here, but I'll try and like show you with the little circles moving around. Luke basically dived onto the central objective and force pushed one of the B1s that had activated back, and then did a couple of wounds to the other one. However, Count Dooku then came in and force lightninged. He force pushed Luke out and then force lightninged him away. So Luke ended up really far back and out in the open. Fortunately, most of his stuff had gone by this point, but it still put Luke in a bit of a precarious position for the start of the next turn. Mando was just sort of trying to plink off a wound or two on the Aquas. I was relying on his surge to crit to get through, and he did manage to do 2 Pierce 1 this turn, to be fair, so there was 1 Aqua down on that right-hand unit. And then the Magnas and the B1s just absolutely locked down the central objective. There's nothing I could do about that. And yeah, in terms of scoring this round, I was obviously able to hold the left objective, which was nice. Like, that was at least something I had in this game throughout, was that I wasn't being challenged at all on that left-hand objective, and that felt quite good. But he had, I think, 2 or 3 in scoring on the central, and then like 2 or 3 again on this right-hand one as well. So there's nothing I could do about those. We did get our surface scans off, so it was 4-2. Nothing had taken a whole lot of damage at this point. Luke's defense die against Count Dooku's range attack was quite good, but it was looking pretty bleak already, and I wasn't really able to scratch any of his armor units, and I was getting a little bit worried. Momentum continued into this second turn. You can start to see my unit starting to fall quite quickly. I was able to shoot some crabs down thanks to the Pathfinders and a brave Tauntaun charge. I was able to finish off 1 unit of crabs, but took way too many resources to take them down. You can see here that there's been a big shift in where Mando, Luke, and the Count have ended up. Basically, what happened was I played No Time for Sorrows. I used that to move Luke back behind this LOS blocking on the right-hand side next to Mando. Then Count Dooku went first and dived in on Luke and forced lightning Mando. Only did 2 wounds to Luke, which was pretty nice, actually. Like, I was expecting a lot more. And Mando, I think, took 2 or 3 wounds from Count Dooku's lightning in this case as well. And then Count Dooku force pushed Mando into him. However, because I had force push on Luke, I was able to push Count Dooku away, and also because he'd used burst of speed, I didn't know he'd only be speed 1 in the following turn. So if I was able to get units away from him, that would at least diminish the value that Count Dooku was going to get next turn. But yeah, elsewhere on the board, it was looking pretty bleak. My ATRT was finished off by some long range shots, and yeah, I don't know. The Tauns, after their charge onto the crab, were finished off by the other units. Like, Magnus just shot them down, basically. And while I was able to slow things down a bit, it still was definitely going against me, and I was beginning to lose. Like, I didn't really have any momentum, but there just wasn't a whole lot going for me at this point, and I was holding my Tauns and my fleets back as best I could to try and wait for that turn where they maybe could go grab initiative on the central objective, but yeah, it wasn't really happening. Leia and the troopers took some speculative shots onto the Aquas and the B1s and were able to plink, a wound or two off, but again, that's not going to be the kind of thing that shifts the battle in my favour. So moving into this turn, I popped Son of Skywalker to try and go for it. I was able to beat up a unit of Magnas on the central objective who'd already taken a wound or two, so that was quite nice, and it also meant that he had one less unit on that central scoring. But aside from that, it was all still looking pretty bleak. And then obviously after Luke killed them, everything else just kind of shot Luke to pieces. So Luke did fine. Like, he got the value off his Son of Skywalker, and that did generate me a bit of space. But yeah, it still wasn't looking great. Elsewhere on the board, I was still holding that left objective quite nicely with the troopers, which was good. But yeah, I was now out of Tauns. My fleets had gone down thanks to just the Aquas just slowly shooting them down out of like heavy cover, which was just so frustrating. And then I had to dive in with Mando onto the crab that was challenging this objective, just so I didn't lose any more VP. So because I'd also lost Luke, I'd now lost my scanner VP at this point. So the only points I was getting was the points on the left. And actually, I was just about able to hold this one on the right, thanks to the Pathfinders being alive on I think it was like 1 HP on Bistan and then 1 HP on the leader or something, thanks to a ranged attack from Dooku. So I was able to just about hold this one, but yeah, it was looking quite bleak. And again, there's just nothing I could do about the central objective at this point. Like, I don't have the firepower left to deal with that one. You will notice all these games only ran to round 4. Unfortunately, we just didn't have the time in the tournament setting to go beyond that, so the game did end at that point. If it had continued, no way am I winning this game. I think I would have held the left-hand objective, but the central objective and the right-hand objective were definitely going to my opponent, and there's nothing I realistically could have done about that. So would have ended like, what is that, 7, 14 or 15 or something. Like, yeah, it was looking pretty bleak. But yeah, overall, went 2-1, which absolutely fine with. As I say, it was a very casual tournament, and it was just people bringing stuff that was a little bit off meta, as you can probably tell for some of the lists we've seen. And yeah, had a really good time. In terms of how the individual units in my army performed, Leia did what she normally does. If she's behind your army providing dodges, that's great. If she's out in the main sort of thrust of things, she's going to die, and that's what happened. Luke with Force Push is one of the best objective playing units in the game. He is impossible to tie down. He is surprisingly tough, and I think with Hunter can do a really solid amount of damage. I think what Luke needs more than anything else in his current form is either if you can get tenacity active on him, or if you can get some source of aims, he becomes a significantly more sort of a damage threat than he is without them, because without aims his saber's normally doing like 4.2 4.3 wounds, I think, and with that aim it goes up to like 5.5 or something, which is a huge change. And like 5 and a bit Pierce 2 is really strong and able to finish off core units, which is really valuable. Also makes him much more of a threat. The Hunter tenacity thing for damage, I'm not really sure which is which. Like, if you're sending him after heroes or B2s or whatever, like, or even Magnas if you're desperate, like, it can be quite useful, especially with that Son of Skywalker. If you get wounds on them in the first attack, you're getting an aim in the second attack. Like, it can be quite good. But yeah, it's tricky with Hunter. Maybe you just want into the fray for the extra survivability. I really enjoyed Mando. Grogu's not the way to go. Grogu is super fun, and I think is better than people might assume. But he's basically, in this army, I had to choose between Grogu and the Beskar Spear. The Beskar Spear would have just been straight up better, and like, I think offers Mando like a legitimate like melee threat. Like, his vibro knife is okay, but yeah, it it really does pump up his damage quite a lot. So I think obviously if you're going meta, you probably just go Flamer, Jetpack, Beskar Spear, and Comms Relay if you really want it. Yeah, Sleeper Cell did Sleeper Cell things. They dominated in the first game. Like the ability for Sleeper Cell just to clear up units is like it's the thing is with Sleeper Cell is I think you end up being like, oh, Sleeper Cell didn't do anything this game. They just died again. But that's the point. Like if they are targeted down early, which is what you kind of expect, then obviously they're not going to do anything. But if they're not targeted down early, they can be such a threat in the mid to late game when people maybe don't have like the big damage sources left. Because an average shot from them after a move is, I think, dealing like 8 to 9 hits, maybe 10. Like, and converting Surge is just such a big deal on that dice pool. Like, it is very scary, and especially in this time of there being like vehicles and more armor and droidicas, aquas, all these like ATRTs, all these things hanging around, just having a because you're not worried about cover suddenly when you're shooting at those units, all you care about is raw hits, and that's what Sleeper Cell provide and do really well. So yeah, they are I maybe not Rebel's strongest unit, but in terms of like the value you get from just them with an Astro, it's pretty phenomenal. I'm really warming up on fleets, actually. Like, I mean, again, this feels quite knee-jerky, but having played against quite a few ATRTs recently, and having seen Aquas today in this tournament, I think just having a large dice pool with any amount of Pierce is just so important, because like when you commit to an attack against these things, you need to make sure it's worth it. You need to make sure you're getting value. And if fleets can deal like 4 or 5 wounds to a unit of Aquas, or even like on a high roll blow away unit of Droidicas or something, that just feels so good and is a legitimate threat, which is what I think Rebels really need. ATRTs, as I said in previous video, phenomenally efficient and are going to be part of Rebel lists for a while if things go the way I think they're going to go when Aquas and Crabs join the meta. Not so much Crabs, but I think Aquas will. Rebel Troopers, good value. I love an ion gun, and it sounds counterintuitive because I'm saying that I think droids are really good, but I think taking heavy weapons on a quite inconsistent and relatively small dice pool is possibly not worth it. Even though it gives you good keywords, I'm not sure it's worth it. Tauns are too expensive. They're not worth 95 points. They're very good, and if they in the right situations, they are really strong. Having the ability to move that far and make relentless attacks is amazing. What they basically want to do is they want to pick on isolated backmarker units. And I think if you're running something like shifting priorities, or even like breakthrough, actually, like if they're like they did maybe in my second game, if you're able to use them to help you win an objective on one side of the board, they're one of the few units at the game that is then going to be able to go over to the other side of the board and also be a threat. Because with their speed 3 move, with their base, they have an effective threat range of, I think, just over range 5, which is kind of crazy, and it's not a terrible dice pool. So yeah, I think they are interesting. I think just bring them down to like, what would be good? 85, 90? They might be slightly too good at 85, but at least 90. Like, they just need something because they're so expensive right now. Like, you can get an ATRT with a cannon that has armor 2 for 60 points. Like, 3 ATRTs are less than 2 Tauntauns, and that is crushing for Tauns. Bistan Pathfinders are great, and I think if you are stuck for a unit to drop into an army, they are always going to be consistent, and you can use them to frustrate your opponent, to take away actions, and that just feels great. So I think they are still and will continue to be a really important unit in the Rebel arsenal. But yeah, I won't do a tier list or anything like that. Just more of a general review. I'm going to have a brief rant about Aquas now, and then I think we'll probably bring it to a close. I don't understand how Aquas can exist in the same game as like the Wookiees do, because they're both 3 health. They both move at similar speeds because even though Aquas are only speed 1, they have a big base, so they actually move further than the Wookiees do, I think. Um, and they have better saves and they have armor, and with their heavy weapon, they actually have a pretty reasonable dice pool. They surge to hit. Their basic gun is better than the Wookiees. Like, I have just a little bit of a feeling that maybe they've made Aquas a little bit too strong and made them really expensive so that people will buy them because they're quite good. Yeah, and like infiltrate is a phenomenal keyword in this game. Like they just do everything so well, and that armor too is just rushing against like smallish dice pools. So it'll be interesting to see if they end up being a key part of the meta. It's interesting the slot they're in because initially when I saw they were in heavy, I was like, "What? That doesn't make any sense." And I don't really care theme wise, but I'm more thinking about list building wise. But you know, if you want to run, I wonder if the most optimum combination might be something like 2 of these and the snail, or 2 of these and the AAT or something. Yeah, I don't know. They just feel very efficient, and I think it was just facing off against them. I was like, I don't know how to deal with this. Like, they've got 12 wounds with armor and with white surging, like, and they've got a reasonable dice pool. Yeah, just a thought. Well, maybe I'll come back to this in a few months' time and realize I was just rambling because slightly salty. But yeah, it was fine. But overall, yeah, had a really good time. I think a really interesting like take on a tournament that was a bit more casual, no prize pool or anything like that. Just literally people playing out games with sort of some slightly off meta lists, which was really nice to see. So yeah, and really enjoyed the Grogu mirror match. Like I don't know if that'll ever happen again. I'm not quite sure the meta's ready. But yeah, drop a like, drop a subscribe. I hope like the maps and stuff all made sense. I did take a bunch of photos, but I always find for me when I watch like a tournament report or something that the photos by themselves don't give a clear idea of what was actually happening on the board. So I've tried to give an idea of what was going on the board each turn and sort of where each unit ended up at the end of each turn. So hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, like, subscribe, etc. And see you for the next one.